I want to start my talk with a little story, if I could. True story. A friend of mine lives in London, a big, impersonal metropolitan city. Consequently, he knows his neighbours, his next-door neighbour, but not very well. He knows his name, not much more than that, and they exchange polite pleasantries every now and again. Anyway, earlier this year, the neighbour went off on holiday. He hadn't been gone for more than a few hours when my friend's dog lolloped over the intervening fence, only to reappear a few minutes later with the neighbour's pet rabbit in his mouth. Dirty, dishevelled, and very, very dead. Well, my friend panicked. He couldn't possibly. He knows his neighbour not well enough to fess up to a crime like this, and he couldn't think what to do. And then he had a bright idea, and he managed to get the rabbit off the dog. He took it to the outside tap, and he washed it down and cleaned all the crap off it, and then he sneaked back over the fence and put it back in its cage. Said nothing. The neighbour came home. Nothing was said. Nothing happened. So I thought he'd got away with that one. A few weeks later, he happened to see his neighbour, and again, social pleasantries, and he asked him, had he had a nice holiday? And the neighbour said, yeah, I did. I had a very nice little break, thank you. Mind you, he said, there's something really, really weird happened. The day we were going away, didn't the family rabbit just take up and die? We couldn't think what to do, so in the end, we just buried it in the garden. But when we came back, which really just leads into the first point I want to make, that good social marketing start with your problem definition. If you don't work out what your problem is, you will spend your professional life putting dead rabbits back in cages. So we need to think about what it is we are trying to do before we get our toolkit out and start to think of our strategies and so on. First of all, what is the problem? And that's what I want to try and talk about in this first session. What are the problems we are facing now? What are the difficulties that present to our society? And for me, I start off from a professional point of view, from my experience, which has been very much in the public health end of social marketing, particularly in the areas of tobacco, alcohol, fast food. And clearly the implications are that these problems, which underpin a lot of the downsides of public health, a lot of the early deaths out in our society, are thanks to booze, fags, and inappropriate diet. And those are, of course, driven by marketing. They are commercial problems. The commercial drivers of ill health are very much important to that. So understanding that makes you think about the impact of commerce on our daily lives. And of course, it takes you rapidly beyond these sort of specific behaviours to what we spend a lot of our time doing, which is shopping. Consuming things and what impacts that has on us, how that works. Now, you can't think about that very long before you start to trip over issues such as inequalities. Issues, of course, such as the climate, and the latest IPCC report showing that things are getting pretty desperate in that space. So we start to think about what the problems that those are causing and what we do about it. And what this leads us to do, and really what I want to talk about today, is it leads us to think critically about our way of life. Not just to end up wringing our hands and say, oh God, this is terrible, but also recognize that once we do that, we can start to tackle these problems. Having decided that the rabbit had been buried and it doesn't need putting back in its cage, you can start to get on with your neighbour in a more constructive, more sensible way. We can start to do something about the problems that we face, in other words. First step is to understand them. As David said at the outset, education is vital to that. We've got to understand those problems. But having understood them, we then need to be empowered, enacting solutions to those problems. In short, what we need to be is rebellious. We need to criticize. We need to look carefully and thoughtfully, and not just accept givens, but we also need to do that with some sense of purpose, some way forward, not just, I don't like what you're doing. It's about how we can take this forward collectively to a better space. And the stuff that's coming down the road on climate is in one sense terrifying, but in another sense is profoundly empowering. What it means is things are going to change. We are social marketers. We deal in change. It's our core business. We can do this stuff. Furthermore, change is not something new to humankind. We face changes, mammoth changes, throughout the existence of our species. So it's not even new. But we've got to think about it clearly and intelligently if we're going to act on that empowerment. I want to start, though, with that negative side of marketing that's often paraded. And it's very clear now that on those three behaviors I talked about at the outset, marketing's harmful effects have been well and truly established. Think about tobacco and the role of tobacco marketing, encouraging young people into tobacco use. If you think about alcohol, exactly the same data set showing that this pulls people into unfortunate and damaging habits, and the same with food. And for people who are marketers in the room, this is bleeding obvious stuff. Of course it does. I mean, these companies would not pay people to produce fancy advertising campaigns if it didn't have these sorts of effects. So there's massive issues there. However, I would say that all this is absolutely right, but I think it's wrong to shoot the marketer. I think the problem here isn't the marketer, isn't marketing. The problem is power. Let me explain what I mean. If we think about what marketing is, it is a profoundly human activity. It takes us back to the very origins of our species. It's about doing deals. I want something, you've got that something. If we can come together and you'll give me that something in return for something from me, some sort of mutually beneficial exchange, then we have exactly that. We have a very benign way forward. And indeed, there's very strong arguments to show that humankind is very weak animal on his or her own. It's only in the group, the collective, that they can survive the saber-toothed tigers and the what-have-yous of a difficult environment. So you have mutual beneficial exchange. That translates into the modern world with the shopkeeper. So it's now become a bit commercialized as money being changed hands. But we've had the shopkeepers not too big and not too dominant in the marketplace. Again, there's some sort of mutual benefit going on. It all works reasonably well. That starts to look very different when you're talking about organizations that have massive budgets. So Coca-Cola's own figures suggest they spend $3 billion a year advertising their product. And when you've got that on one side of the equation, on the other side, a vulnerable teenager who wants to look cool or wants to get on with their pals, then it starts to look like something very different. And if you add into that mix that they will use the best of most powerful persuasive techniques, using the best of advertisers' knowledge, the best of psychology, the best of sociology, the best of anthropology to get this across. They'll spend massive amounts of money on it. They will build brands that encapsulate this power very, very efficiently, so that the word Coca-Cola becomes better known on the planet than the word Jesus. This is powerful stuff. And then on top of that, they've got the digital arena where this has become utterly ubiquitous and very often difficult to distinguish from social discourse. So it does result in immense power. Then you've got something very, very different going on, and it becomes much more manipulative. And when you talk about young people, particularly so. And if you put this into a geopolitical direction, if you look at this on a global basis, you've got much of the corporate power exists in the wealthy north. And it's being used in a way that's almost akin to commercial imperialism. People do talk in marketing circles about the second grab for Africa, for example. And it's happening at a cost. This is taken from the Financial Times last week, a piece there. Chains such as Burger King, Pizza Hut, and KFC are proliferating across Africa. Meanwhile, obesity rates are skyrocketing across the continent. 8 of the 10 nations with the fastest rising rates of obesity are in Africa. So it is happening, and we'll come back to that article because it has some other things to say about inequalities, which are also very arresting. Am I standing too close to the speaker? Is that the problem? Okay. And with the sorts of profits and turnover that these companies get, comes immense power. This is the Indian author Arundhati Roy talking, saying about how they can buy their way into positions of immense influence in society. And we see that now. And a lot of what's happening in North America with Donald Trump, in my own country with Brexit and all the turmoil that's creating, the nationalism that's reasserting itself in many countries, including the east of Europe. This is driven by the fact that governments and very powerful financial interests seem to be speaking to each other, but not to the people. And people feel left out, neglected, and put upon by this. And Aaron Harty-Roy is predicting this, essentially. Again, if we start to think of this not just in terms of the population as a whole for a minute, but in terms of children who are just beginning to form, to understand themselves, to try and develop their own identities and make their own decisions, then it becomes very, very concerning that in this formative stage, when they're still very fluid, almost like a molten rock, that is then cast into a shape that's very difficult to change thereafter. And that's a shape that's about consumption, producing everything you need in life, from the basic necessities through to spiritual enlightenment, comes over the counter of a shop. And as Bertrand Russell put it, it is a preoccupation with possession that results more than anything else that prevents men from living freely and nobly. I don't know why it was gender specific. It applies to us all. But it's not just about children. We are all prone to this. We're all responsive to it. It's very easy to fall into it. Just consider the idea of bottled water. I'm showing my age, but first half of my life, we did not drink bottled water. There was a tap which had water in it, and you drank out of that. And it's now become so normalized that we do it all the time. I'm about to have a drink myself out of a bottle of water in a second. We just do it as a matter of course. We forget that this is a slightly odd situation when it's free and potable everywhere. In a country like Australia or the UK, certainly, that's just true. So let's think about that for a little minute. This is a wee character created by the French author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince. People are familiar with him? If you're not, get the book, read it. It's very, very interesting. There's a little scene in that. This character, the Little Prince, who's come from another planet, is wandering around meeting various people, and he meets a marketer. Hello, says the marketer. Hello, says the Little Prince. Hello, says the marketer. And this marketer sold clever pills which quench thirst. Just have to take one a week, and you save all the trouble of drinking water. So you've gone one step on. This is the ultimate bottle of water. Why are you selling these pills? Asked the Little Prince. Because they save a lot of time, said the marketer. Experts have calculated that these pills can save 53 minutes a week. And what do you do with those 53 minutes? Whatever you like, says the marketer. Little Prince thinks for a moment and says, if I had an extra 53 minutes, I would walk very slowly towards a drinking fountain, questioning the idea of buying stuff all the time in order to satisfy our needs. This ties us into this idea that was a term invented by Jehiel and Baber back in 2007, the idea of the Industrial Epidemic. And this is Margaret Chan, the Director General of the World Health Organization, saying what that means in reality. It means that much of the work of an organization like the World Health Organization is spent combating big food, big soda, big alcohol, big tobacco. We're pushing in the opposite direction because quite legitimately in our system, they're maximizing shareholder value all the time. There's a clash between that and public welfare. And that leads inevitably to the idea of the need for regulation and containment of these commercial forces. Add to those problems of industrial epidemics the problems of systemic inequalities. We know this data so familiar, it almost becomes forgotten in its familiarity, hidden in plain sight. But a FTSE 100 CEO earns as much as 10,000 workers in a garment factory. And this is a dangerously critical angle on what the result of this, basically saying that means some are very poor, while others are living in ridiculous plenitude. So much stuff they don't know how to deal with it. The only thing they can do is show it off. And ultimately, if we all follow down this route, we will destroy the planet we live on. And that comes from a document called Laudato Si, which you might think is some Marxist splinter group, because it's so critical of capitalism here. It's actually the Vatican is saying this. And as Thomas Piketty, the French economist's work of 2016 shows, these flaws, these inequalities are not accidental. They are absolutely systemic to the system, and they will continue to get worse. Essentially because if you've got a lot of money, you will always make more by investing that money than anybody working to earn the money will make in the first place. So Oxfam earlier this year concluded that 8 men, and this is specifically gender specific because they are men, have the same wealth between them as a poised half of the planet. Massive, massive inequalities. And this is going back to the Financial Times article I quoted earlier. Although the world produces enough food to feed everyone 1.5 times over, hunger is once again on the rise. 821 million people go to bed hungry each night, which, I don't know, surprised or not by that. I'm not quite sure what 821 million looks like. What really shook me wasn't that that's a quarter of the population in Africa, which is terrible enough, but 15% of Americans go to bed hungry. It's incredible. The final aspect of the system I just want to dwell on before we move on is our relationship with nature. And this is underpinning the problems that are happening now. I would argue that essentially capitalism looks at nature as something to be exploited. It's an infinite source of cheap stuff on the one hand and a great dustbin on the other. So, cheap labor, you think of the sweatshops, materials, you think of the exploitation of fossil fuels, the debate in Australia at the moment about coal-fired power stations and so on. The externalities, as economists talk, which as far as I can see, is a way of committing direct fraud on the planet. You don't pay for the damage you do, basically ignore that because it's so expensive. And a dustbin. So you think of things like the trash vortex. We know this stuff. We know that we are just beginning to catch up with what we've done with plastics in the environment. This is inevitably leading to climate breakdown. I use the phrase climate breakdown rather than the common one, which is climate change, in deference to George Monbiot, who's quoted up there. He argues that using the term climate change to describe what is happening is akin to describing an invading army as uninvited guests. So different. Climate change sounds quite nice. This is not going to be nice, he argues. And the new IPCC report 12 years to sort this mess. And even that is seen by many climate experts as being very, very conservative because it doesn't take into account the unpredictable, which is particularly negative feedback. So as you start to melt the ice in the Arctic, so worse things will happen that you can't predict. This has immense implications for our natural world. That report says that if we keep to 1.5 degrees of climate warming, then that will mean that only 70 to 90% of coral will disappear. Only 70 to 90%. That's the best case scenario. If we don't make that, if it goes to 2 degrees, it's all gone. Furthermore, this is a paper, well-respected paper in the journal Nature, which shows that our chances of staying just at 1.5 are about 1%. And to do that, the committee argue that we will need fundamental societal and system transformation. So change is a-coming. If we contrast for that for the moment, we started today by thanking the indigenous peoples for the use of their land. If we start to look at how indigenous people think about nature, you get a very different view of it. This is a quote from a Native American Indian talking about the Wild West only arrived when Europeans came and started behaving in the way they were. Until then, they saw this as a place of peace and harmony and plenty. I'm saying the same thing in shorter words. Only when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish has been caught, the last stream has been poisoned, we realize that we cannot eat money. So again, to quote Aaron Harty-Roy, we have to start thinking of indigenous peoples, not as some relic of the past, but as our guides to the future, because they are the ones who have lived sustainably for thousands upon thousands of years. We have singularly failed to do that. So people do talk about the Anthropocene now. This is a period of climate, the planet's existence is driven by human activity, human activity. Although some would argue that that is an exaggeration because it's saying this is down to all people. It's not. It's people in certain parts of the world behaving in a certain way. So they prefer to use the word capitalocene to describe it because ugly word, but what it's saying is we have to look at the economic system, not the species. People didn't always shop at Primark. It's a relatively new phenomenon in the human experience. So the system is undoubtedly flawed. Okay? It's in a bad way. And it's tempting at this point to say, well, it's just a terrible system. And, it's not my fault. The trouble is that we are the system. We're all part of this. We're not standing outside it. It's not over there, some other people doing this. We're all doing this. We're all equally involved in it. Ours is a consumer society built around our needs. We know this stuff. We're marketers. Marketing is about making what you can sell, not selling what you can make. About listening to us. Endless market research to ensure that every need, every want, every whim is catered for. The customer is king. Consumer orientation, consumer satisfaction, excellent customer service are watchwords of our system. We are pampered and indulged at every turn. We love it. We love it. Bottled water, fast fashion, a gross excess of stuff. We love it so much, we buy loyalty cards. In Britain, we love these. Tesco's has 16 million members of its loyalty club. The dictionary definition of loyalty is a feeling of devotion, duty, or attachment to somebody. We love it. We love it. Let's talk about the implications. Let's talk about smartphones for a minute. I apologize for this, because it's really hurtful, this stuff, but let's go for it. Coltan is a mineral found in the Democratic Republic of Congo in West Africa. Virtually all of it is there. It is an essential component to all our smartphones. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a mess. There's no health and safety, there's no regulation. Consequently, much of this is mined by children who have no rights, paid very little, get next to nothing. This is just one example from Amnesty International. Deku, who does it with his twin brother, makes bugger all money, just manages to survive on it. And as Mark Dunnett here from Amnesty says, the glamorous shop displays contrast drastically and awfully with this reality. And yes, I, along with many others, would argue that that should be regulated. But, and it's an enormous but, at the end of the day, we choose to buy these things. We don't have to. Nobody takes us into an Apple shop and says, thou shalt buy this, otherwise I will cut your leg off. We voluntarily, and we pay a lot of money for that privilege. So we are part of the system. The massive problems of being caused by consumer capitalism depend on willing consumers, on us. Marketing is the keeper of a dangerous but highly profitable secret. It knows how to present a sense of universal neediness, a setup of wanting without end, a culture of desire which must not be thwarted. Very grim. But the same writer, Seabrook, goes on to give us a shaft of light. That this power is actually very fragile. All that is needed for it to fail is that people should declare themselves content with what they have. It's stunning, isn't it? It's like flicks the light on it. Bloody hell, yeah, that's a good point. And herein lies the hope. It is our system. We can change it. As the liberation theologists said, it's not about giving them a fish. It's not even about teaching them to fish. It's about recognizing their ownership of the river. It's our river. We need to do something about this. Yes, that speaks to all the negative stuff that I've been rabbited on about so far. Responsibility, culpability, obligations, all that stuff. But it also speaks to exactly what this conference is about empowerment, about rights, about human potential, our capacity to make things different. And the human case, there's one lesson from human capacity, from human history. It's our capacity for ingenuity, for change, for doing the most magnificent, wonderful things. So we move, as marketers inevitably do, from threats to opportunities. IPCC is telling us that change is inevitable. But maybe we shouldn't be wringing our hands about that. Maybe we should be quite glad, because this system is pretty damn flawed. It should change. It needs to change. And ordinarily, I think there'd be very little chance of getting any attention from anyone in power to change these things. What's happening with climate means that they're going to have to pay attention. And we are social marketers. These are just some definitions of social marketing being written down over the years. And the connecting theme in them all is change. It's what we do. Our moment has arrived. Furthermore, change itself is not something we should be frightened of. It happens in any developing situation, let alone with a species like humanity. So if you think over the years, we've gone from hunter-gatherer to settled agriculture, industrial revolution, and now to digital economies. Communication has gone from language to writing to printing to the internet. Our polity has gone from the tribe to the city-state to the nation-state to the planet. And this is where we've now arrived. You might call, for my term, but for want of a better one, the planetary phase. This is where we are now. This is where things really are beginning to happen. And we have people's attention. Naomi Klein makes a very good point that at this moment, what we need above all else is a plan. What happens next? As the events on climate get more and more difficult to ignore, what are we going to suggest? When the politician eventually comes along and says, oh, God, they've got this wrong, what do we do? What's going to be our answer? Klein is referring back to the financial crisis of 2008 and what happened with the Occupy movement. And essentially the problem with Occupy is that they didn't know what they wanted to do. They didn't have an alternative ready. Or they did, but they had hundreds of alternatives and none of them could agree on them. We need to do some thinking about this. And the odds are in our favor. We are at this global phase when humanity, for the first time in history, is beginning to think as a unified group across the world. So capital and capitalism are obviously global. Technology is global. Our impact on the planet is clearly global. And more encouragingly, concern about that impact is global and growing. And is particularly great in the poorer countries as opposed to the rich countries, for the sad reason that they are suffering the worst effects of this at the moment. Governance is global, thinking particularly of human rights in the United Nations. Yeah, flawed, difficulties with it, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights exists. That's a tremendous opportunity. Above all, our humanity, our capacity for change is global. It's what human beings do. So we begin to think about what form change would take. Do we become completely depressed about it, or is it just going to be catastrophic and hopeless? Which I think a lot of the narrative is about at the moment. Profoundly unhelpful, because all you can do is scream. Is it going to be evolutionary? Are we going to do this gradually, like regulating it, which is a bit like what is happening in the industrial epidemics territory? I think, my experience of that is very, very slow. Or is there a third, some transformational opportunity? Is it back to some sort of idyll of rural, small-scale society? Or is there a new vision we can come up with? A practical, sustainable solution to our problems? And what would that look like? We need a plan. So what kind of world do you want? What should it be like? Given that we've not got it right at the moment, clearly, what's it going to be like? What values, what community, what equality, what culture? What are all these issues going to look like? We as social marketers can and should be thinking about that, can and should be seeing how we could deliver that. We need a plan. So to end then, what I am trying to argue is that what's happening with the planet at the moment is concentrating minds and hearts very effectively. Very often the response to that is one of terror, and almost is becoming something you don't talk about in social gatherings. To dinner party for somebody who introduces this into the topic of conversation is to kill the dinner party. But as the inevitable change unfolds, as more people from all sorts of backgrounds and groups and countries and societies become more critically engaged with what is happening, as our leaders are compelled to take action, to lead, in other words, we need a plan. What contribution can we social marketers make in helping devise this plan? That's a question I want to ask you. That's a question I think we should be discussing. And one final thought. If all this seems a bit too bloody hard, if it's just a bit too brain-crushingly difficult to imagine how we'd do this, I'll leave you the words of Alice Walker, the North American writer. Activism is my rent for living on the planet. Thank you for listening.